Jake Carter had spent his whole life in the saddle, riding across wide-open spaces where the wind always smelled of dust and sagebrush. He'd felt pain before, the sting of a lasso burn, the ache in his muscles after a long day on the range, the bruises from a hard fall. Pain was something every cowboy got used to. But there were two types of pain, the old hand said, one that hurts you and one that changes you. Jake had lived through the first kind plenty of times. It was the second type that scared him. It was late afternoon when Jake rode into town, his horse tired and his thoughts heavy. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the empty streets of Silver Creek. The town was quieter than usual, and Jake couldn't help but feel that same uneasy silence that had been hanging over him for the past few weeks. Maybe it was the air, thick with change, or maybe it was something deeper that he couldn't name. Jake had come back to town because of a letter. His brother, Eli, had sent it just days before, saying that things had gotten bad at the ranch. He hadn't gone into details, but the urgency in Eli's words had been clear. Family was family, and Jake owed Eli everything. As he tied his horse to the hitching post in front of the general store, Jake couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in his gut. He had been to the ranch only a month ago. Things had been good then. Nothing special, just the usual work. But now, something was different. He could feel it in the air, like a storm was brewing on the horizon. He walked into the saloon, hoping to find Eli. The heavy wooden door swung open with a creak, and Jake's boots echoed on the worn floorboards. The saloon was as quiet as the street had been, save for a few drunks slouched over their drinks. Behind the bar stood a man Jake didn't recognize, his back to him. The place had changed since Jake had last been here. New faces, new owners, and no sign of Eli. "Afternoon," Jake called out, his voice cutting through the quiet. The bartender turned, his eyes narrowing when he saw Jake. "What do you want, stranger?" "I'm looking for my brother, Eli Carter. He's still around?" The bartender's eyes flickered for a moment before he slowly nodded toward the back of the saloon. "He's in the back room, sitting alone." Jake's heart clenched, and he walked toward the back. The door to the room was cracked open, and inside, Eli sat at a table, his face drawn and tired. Jake hadn't seen his brother look like this in years. Eli was always the one who kept things together when life got tough. But now, there was a weight in his eyes that Jake couldn't ignore. "Eli?" Jake said, stepping inside. Eli looked up, startled, and then his expression softened. He stood slowly, as if the simple act of moving hurt him. "Jake," he said, his voice hoarse. "You came." Jake closed the door behind him and crossed the room to his brother's side. "Of course I came. What happened?" Eli didn't answer right away. Instead, he sat back down and stared at the floor. "It's the ranch. It's gone to hell. I don't know what to do anymore, Jake." Jake took a chair across from Eli and leaned in. "Talk to me. What's going on?" Eli looked up then, his face twisted with the kind of grief that made Jake's chest tighten. "The cattle, Jake. They're dying, and I don't know why. We've tried everything. The feed, the water. We even had a vet come out. Nothing's working." Jake's mind raced. He had seen the signs of disease before, but this wasn't just disease. Something else was wrong. "You sure it's not just sickness?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. Eli shook his head, his eyes clouded with despair. "No, it's worse than that. I've been looking at the books. The numbers don't add up, Jake. We're losing cattle and the bank's coming for us. I'm about to lose everything, and I don't know how to stop it." Jake felt the weight of his brother's words. The ranch had been their father's pride, passed down to them after he'd passed away. It was their life. To lose it, well, that would be a kind of death in itself. But Jake had seen his brother face worse, and he wasn't about to let him give up now. "I'll help you," Jake said. "We'll figure this out." Eli's eyes were hollow, as if he had already given up. "I don't think there's any fix in this, Jake." Jake stood up. "You're wrong. We'll fix it. We always do." It took them days to dig into the ranch's finances, weeks to figure out what had gone wrong. But what they discovered wasn't just bad luck or poor planning, it was sabotage. Someone had been intentionally overfeeding the cattle, pushing them beyond their limits. The feed was tainted and the water contaminated. Someone had been trying to make the cattle sick, and it was all done under the guise of bad management. And that's when the truth hit Jake. His brother wasn't just being reckless. Someone had been setting him up to fail. It wasn't the first time Jake had seen this kind of thing in the West. Ranchers getting taken for a ride by men looking to make a quick buck, but it still stung. It wasn't just the cattle. It was their livelihood, their home, everything they had worked for. And now it was slipping through their fingers. Jake and Eli confronted the man responsible, a neighboring rancher named Rufus Caldwell, a man who had always smiled too much and said too little. It was Caldwell's feed that had poisoned their herd, Caldwell's men who had sabotaged their water supply, and it was Caldwell who had been using their ranch's failing condition to push them out and take over the land. The confrontation happened in the middle of the ranch, in the dusty wind, with the sun high overhead. It wasn't much of a fight, just words, hard words, and the crack of reality hitting them both. Jake had been ready to go to the sheriff, but before he could say a word, Eli stopped him. "No need," Eli said, his voice flat. "There's no fight to be had. The damage is done." Jake didn't understand at first, but then Eli looked him in the eyes, and Jake saw it. The same thing he had felt in his own chest for years, the weight of it all. They had been fighting to hold on to something that was already slipping away. "There are two kinds of pain," Eli said quietly, his voice breaking the silence. "One that hurts you and one that changes you." Jake's stomach churned. He understood then. The pain they were feeling, the loss, the betrayal, wasn't the kind that broke you. It was the kind that reformed you. It turned you into something else, something harder, something stronger. And it hurt just as much as anything else, maybe more. Jake stood beside his brother, the wind blowing through the open fields where the cattle once grazed. "You ready to change, Eli?" Eli didn't answer right away. Instead, he just looked at the land. "I don't know if I'm ready, but I reckon it doesn't matter." Jake put a hand on his brother's shoulder. "Then let's figure out what comes next." And as they stood there in the silent space between what had been and what was to come, Jake knew that the pain they felt would never go away. But maybe that was a good thing, because sometimes the pain that changes you is the only kind worth living through.